It was one of those bright Saturday mornings when everything felt peaceful. The air smelled faintly of fresh mulch, the sound of distant lawnmowers hummed softly, and my garden was in full bloom. Roses, tulips, and marigolds painted my front yard in waves of red, yellow, and orange. I had spent months tending to it, watering, pruning, and planting with care. That's when I saw it, a thin white envelope tucked under my front door mat, peeking out like it was waiting to ruin my day. It was from the Homeowners Association. The bold, printed words at the top said, "Violation Notice," followed by my address. I tore it open, still expecting something minor, a reminder about trash day, maybe. Instead, my stomach tightened. According to the notice, my flowers were non-compliant with community guidelines because they were too bright and distracting to the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. The HOA demanded I remove or replace them with muted, uniform plants and pay $5,000 fine for failure to adhere to visual conformity standards. $5,000. At first, I laughed. Surely, this had to be a mistake. My flowers weren't some neon light show. They were just flowers. But the more I read, the more I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. The notice cited obscure sections of the HOA handbook, rules I didn't even know existed, rules that, apparently, gave them the right to control the color palette of residents' front yards. The letter said I had 14 days to comply. If I didn't, further legal action would follow. That's when the disbelief turned into anger. My home was my space. I paid my dues. I kept my yard clean. And now, because someone, probably a board member with too much time on their hands, didn't like my flowers, I was facing the threat of thousands of dollars in fines. I spent the next couple of days replaying the situation in my head. Every time I drove through the neighborhood, I noticed all the little details I had ignored before. Some houses had lawn ornaments, some had faded shutters, some had weeds poking through the grass, all technically non-compliant if the handbook was applied strictly. But those homes weren't fined. It started to feel targeted. And then I remembered, 2 months earlier, the HOA president, a sharp-tongued woman named Linda, had made an offhand comment during a casual conversation about garish gardens lowering property values. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it seemed obvious. She had me in her sights. I decided to review the HOA bylaws myself. I dug out the thick binder they'd given me when I moved in and started reading. Page after page of restrictions. Approved paint colors, mailbox heights, lawn maintenance schedules. And buried deep in the landscaping section was the rule they cited against me. It was vague, subjective, and open to interpretation, exactly the kind of rule that could be used to target someone. The more I read, the more I started to wonder if they were so strict about enforcing these rules. How many of them did they follow themselves? The next morning, I began to pay closer attention. I walked through the neighborhood under the guise of taking a stroll, but I was really taking notes. The HOA president's own house had chipped paint on the porch. Her lawn had patches of bare soil. Her garden lights were solar-powered, which I remembered reading somewhere in the handbook as being restricted to pathway use only. I took pictures. Lots of them, but it wasn't just her. Other HOA board members had violations: 2 mailboxes that didn't match the approved style, fences that were too high, driveways with cracks left unrepaired. And all of these were rules that the handbook said must be enforced. That's when it clicked. If they wanted to come after me for a subjective flower color rule, I could come after them for objective, documented violations they couldn't argue against. I decided I wouldn't just defend myself. I would go on the offensive. I spent the next week gathering everything I could. I printed out the bylaw pages. I matched them with the photos I'd taken. I even pulled up county property records to confirm dates of home improvements that hadn't been approved by the HOA. By the end of the week, I had a neatly organized file folder, one that painted a very different picture of my HOA board. They weren't the enforcers of perfection they pretended to be. They were selectively enforcing rules, and in some cases, ignoring their own blatant violations. The idea of paying them $5,000 now seemed laughable. In fact, I was starting to think they might end up paying me. But I wasn't ready to reveal my hand just yet. I wanted them comfortable, thinking they'd won. The notice gave me 2 weeks to respond, and I planned to use every single day. On day 13, I made my move. I drafted a formal response letter. In it, I politely acknowledged their concerns about my garden, but I also included an attached report, 30 pages long, documenting more than a dozen violations committed by the HOA board members themselves. I noted each one with photographic evidence and a reference to the exact bylaw section they had violated. I ended the letter with a request for these violations to be addressed immediately, citing the HOA's own zero-tolerance policy. And then I sent it certified mail. The board meeting was in 3 days. I knew they would have to address it in front of the other homeowners. And when they did, I'd be ready. The night of the HOA meeting arrived with the kind of tension you could feel in the air. The community center parking lot was full, and the hallway outside the meeting room buzzed with low chatter. Neighbors stood in clusters, clutching coffee cups and folded papers, their voices rising and falling in bursts of speculation. I could tell my letter had already made the rounds. Inside, the long folding tables were set up in a U shape, the board members seated like a panel of judges. At the center, the HOA president, Linda, sat with her arms crossed, flipping through a stack of papers. Her expression was tight, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. The meeting began in the usual way, approving minutes from the last session, skimming through budget updates, and addressing minor concerns about landscaping and street maintenance. It was all routine, a familiar rhythm the board used to keep residents disengaged. But I could see it coming, buried in the printed agenda like a landmine. Item 7, Resident Compliance Issues. When they reached it, Linda cleared her throat, her voice smooth and rehearsed. She began reading my violation, notice aloud, making sure to emphasize the rule about aesthetic harmony and approved vegetation. She didn't mention the fine amount directly, but she didn't have to. The tone said it all. Then she paused, and I knew my moment had arrived. Instead of sitting quietly like they expected, I raised my hand, not to speak, but to slide the thick folder I'd prepared across the table toward the secretary. Every page was clipped, numbered, and tabbed. It wasn't just a list of their violations. It was a roadmap of their hypocrisy. The secretary flipped through the first few pages, her eyes widening slightly. She whispered something to Linda, who took the folder herself. The shift in her expression was almost imperceptible at first. A slight tightening around the jaw, a shallow breath. She flipped faster now, scanning each page, her pen tapping against the table. The room stayed silent except for the rustle of paper. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost that smooth confidence. She said the board would review these materials in private session and follow up accordingly. But she didn't move on to the next agenda item immediately. She hesitated. That's when one of the other residents broke the silence. They asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, if the board's violations would be handled with the same urgency and fines as mine. That single question cracked the meeting open like a dropped vase. Suddenly, neighbors were speaking up, one after another. Some complained about past selective enforcement. Others mentioned letters they had received over trivial matters, while other violations went ignored. The volume in the room rose, voices overlapping, the controlled order of the meeting slipping away. Linda tried to regain control, banging her gavel, but it was too late. The residents had found a common thread, and it wasn't me or my flowers. It was them. By the time the noise settled, it was clear the board had no choice. They announced they would be conducting an internal audit of all board member properties for compliance. They framed it as a goodwill gesture, but I could tell by Linda's tightened lips that it was anything but voluntary. For me, it was a small victory, but not the war. I had shifted the spotlight onto them, but they were still in power. And I knew people like Linda cornered animals don't give up, they lash out. After the meeting, as people filtered out into the parking lot, a few neighbors approached me quietly. They thanked me for speaking up, for finally holding them accountable. Others whispered things they'd noticed, but had been too afraid to report. It was like a dam had cracked, and now everything was spilling out. I walked to my car with my folder under my arm, the night air cool against my face. I could feel eyes on me, watching, measuring. The board had 3 weeks to respond to my letter and the evidence. But I didn't plan on waiting passively. If I was going to end this fight, I needed more than just violations. I needed proof of intent, something that showed they weren't just incompetent, but deliberately abusing their authority. That meant digging deeper into financial records, past meeting minutes, even the history of the so-called aesthetic harmony rule they had used against me. Because I had a suspicion, one that, if proven true, could not only get my fine erased, but might take Linda down completely. The day after the meeting, I began my investigation in earnest. I had learned something valuable in Chapter 2 of this little saga. The HOA thrived on residents being passive, uninformed, and afraid to push back. The moment people started asking questions, cracks began to show. So I decided to dig into every single crack I could find. I started with the HOA meeting minutes. By law, these had to be made available to all residents upon request. Most people never bothered, assuming they were just dull records of who attended and which projects were approved. But buried within them were years of decisions, votes on fines, approvals for home modifications, and budget allocations. I spent hours in the community office, flipping through dusty binders. The smell of old paper and faint mildew filled the air. The further back I went, the more I noticed patterns. Certain residents received fines for trivial things: paint a shade too bright, grass half an inch too tall, while others, including board members, were granted exceptions or grandfathered allowances for the very same issues. Linda's name appeared again and again in those exceptions. I began to wonder how many of the rules were applied based on personal opinion rather than actual policy. My suspicion grew stronger when I found the original entry for the aesthetic harmony clause. It wasn't part of the founding bylaws. It had been added 5 years ago during Linda's presidency, and the justification for the rule, the minutes, recorded a vague statement about preserving property values, backed up by multiple resident complaints about disruptive yard colors. The so-called multiple complaints turned out to be exactly 2, both from people who no longer lived in the neighborhood. That wasn't policy making, that was personal taste turned into law. The next step was to look at the HOA finances. I didn't have direct access to bank records, but the budget summaries were public. Every year, thousands of dollars were allocated to community beautification projects. But when I asked neighbors if they'd seen any major upgrades or repairs in recent years, most just shook their heads. That money was going somewhere, but it wasn't going into the neighborhood. At this point, I decided to visit the county records office. It was tedious work. Rows of file cabinets, computer terminals from the early 2000s, and a clerk who seemed perpetually annoyed by my presence, but it was worth it. That's where I found the gold mine. 3 years ago, the HOA had funded a special landscaping project at a cost of over $12,000. The official reason, to revitalize common green areas, but the invoice listed the address where the work had been done, and it wasn't a park or a playground or a shared space. It was Linda's house. The HOA had paid for her front yard to be completely redesigned, including imported plants, decorative stonework, and irrigation upgrades, all under the guise of a community project, and here she was, fining me for having flowers she didn't like. The hypocrisy was staggering, but I knew I couldn't just throw this information out in anger. I needed to package it carefully, in a way that left no room for her to twist the story. I created a timeline starting from when Linda became president. I linked every major bylaw change, every fine issued, every special project, and every exception granted. The pattern was unmistakable. She was using her position to enforce personal preferences on others while funneling resources into her own property. It was the kind of thing that could ruin her credibility permanently, but I wasn't just thinking about her anymore. The other board members weren't innocent bystanders. Some had their own exceptions and benefits listed in the minutes. They had allowed this to happen for years, either out of laziness or because they were getting perks too. This wasn't just a fight about flowers anymore. It was about exposing a system that had been quietly bleeding the neighborhood for years. By the time I was done, I had 2 thick binders, one with the original evidence of violations, and one with the new financial and historical data. If the first binder had made them uncomfortable, this second one would send shockwaves, but I still needed the right moment. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks away, and I knew Linda would be expecting me to come back swinging. I wanted to do more than that. I wanted to make it impossible for her to stay in power, so I reached out to a few neighbors who had spoken to me after the last meeting. I told them what I'd found, just enough to get their interest, not enough to ruin the impact of the reveal. And then I asked for their help, because the only thing more powerful than evidence is a room full of angry homeowners holding it in their hands. The days leading up to the next HOA meeting felt electric. Word had spread, and for once, it wasn't gossip about whose lawn needed mowing or whose kid dented a mailbox. This was different. There was a buzz in the air, a shared undercurrent of frustration that had been building for years but never had a spark to ignite it. Now they had the spark. I spent those 2 weeks quietly meeting with small groups of neighbors in living rooms, garages, and even one back porch with a cooler of sodas between us. I would bring copies of the key pages from my binders, sliding them across coffee tables and watching expressions shift from curiosity to disbelief to outright anger. It was always the same pattern. At first, they'd think I was exaggerating. Then they'd see the special landscaping project, invoice for Linda's home. Then the meeting minutes where she personally voted to approve exceptions for her friends. Then the bank summary showing thousands of dollars in beautification. Expenses with no visible improvements to community areas. By the time I finished, the reaction was unanimous. This wasn't just unfair, it was theft. We didn't talk in terms of revenge anymore. We talked in terms of removal. Some residents dug into the bylaws and confirmed that the HOA board could be dissolved, or at least restructured, with a majority homeowner vote. Others began calling friends and neighbors who didn't normally attend meetings, urging them to show up. Every conversation added to the growing wave. The morning of the meeting, I printed 60 packets, condensed versions of my binders, stripped down to the essential evidence. I slid each packet into a plain manila folder. The plan was simple: distribute them just before the meeting began, so the board wouldn't have time to prepare a counterattack. When I arrived at the community center that evening, the parking lot was already packed. Inside, the meeting room felt smaller than usual, the air heavy with anticipation. Normally, these gatherings drew maybe 20 people. Tonight, there were at least 3 times that number, lining the walls and filling the chairs. The board members looked uneasy. Linda, usually poised and in control, kept glancing toward the door as if expecting reinforcements that weren't coming. As the last few people filed in, I began handing out the folders, moving quietly from row to row. Each time someone opened one, the same silent reaction rippled across their face: first confusion, then dawning realization, then the quick sideways glance at the board table. When the meeting started, Linda tried to keep the tone light, talking about upcoming community events and maintenance updates. But the atmosphere had shifted. People weren't nodding politely anymore, they were waiting. When the agenda reached the compliance section, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply said I had additional evidence relevant to my violation and the board's enforcement practices. Then I asked the room if they'd all had a chance to review the packets I'd provided. The wave broke. One neighbor asked why HOA funds had been spent on the president's personal property. Another demanded to know why certain homes had been exempted from rules others were fined for. A third pointed out that, according to the bylaws, such actions were grounds for immediate removal from the board. It wasn't a shouting match. It was an organized dismantling. Every question was backed by a page number, a date, a dollar amount. The board couldn't brush it off as rumors or misunderstandings. Linda tried to push back, claiming the projects had been approved and within budget. But each excuse crumbled under the weight of the documented evidence. Her own words, recorded in past meeting minutes, contradicted her. The other board members began shifting in their seats. One of them, a man who had been silent for most of the evening, finally spoke up, not to defend Linda, but to suggest a temporary suspension of her duties while an independent review was conducted. It was the crack in the dam I'd been waiting for. More residents piled on, insisting that a suspension wasn't enough. They wanted a full vote for removal. The tension that had been simmering for years boiled over into decisive action. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the board was fractured. The president's authority was in tatters, and the homeowners were no longer afraid to push back. But as I walked out into the cool night air, I knew it wasn't over. Linda wasn't the type to go quietly, and people like her didn't just surrender power. They schemed to take it back. And I had a feeling she'd be coming for me next. For a brief moment after the meeting, it felt like the neighborhood had shifted. People smiled when they passed me on the street. A few even stopped to thank me for finally doing something about the board. The tension that used to hang over the community had lightened, replaced by the faint sense that change was possible. But I knew better than to think the fight was over. It started small whispers from neighbors that Linda had been explaining her side of the story. At first, I ignored it. Of course, she'd try to save face. But soon the whispers turned into more deliberate actions. One morning, I found a fresh notice taped to my door. This time, the violation wasn't about my flowers. It claimed that my mailbox was non-compliant with the neighborhood standard. The notice cited a regulation buried in the handbook, but I knew for a fact that at least 5 houses on my street had the exact same style mailbox, one of them belonging to a current board member. A few days later, another notice arrived. Now it was my driveway. Apparently, there were visible cracks that needed to be addressed immediately to preserve community value. It was textbook harassment. Small, targeted fines meant to drain my time, energy, and patience. And I wasn't the only one. 2 other residents who had spoken up at the last meeting suddenly found themselves facing surprise inspections and violation letters. It was obvious what was happening. Linda was using what little influence she had left to punish her critics. She was wounded, but she still had enough allies on the board to make life difficult. I realized that if I only reacted to each notice, I'd be stuck in a cycle of defense. I needed to go back on the offensive. This time, though, I had an advantage, an unexpected one. A week after the meeting, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was quiet, cautious. It was one of the other board members, the same man who had suggested Linda's suspension during the meeting. He told me he couldn't speak openly at the last session because of the politics inside the board, but he had seen enough of Linda's behavior over the years to know she was abusing her position. And now that she was under scrutiny, he wanted to make sure she didn't claw her way back into power. Then he said something that caught my attention. He had access to the HOA internal emails. At first, I thought it was just more policy chatter and procedural nonsense. But when he sent me a small batch to review, my jaw tightened. There were months, years of exchanges between Linda and certain board members openly discussing how to deal with troublesome residents. My name appeared more than once, alongside phrases like "make an example" and "build a paper trail for removal." The harassment wasn't just petty, it was premeditated. Worse, there were emails tying directly into the financial discrepancies I had found earlier. Linda had explicitly directed HOA funds toward community projects that were, in reality, personal upgrades for friends and allies. In one message, she even joked that the beautification budget was her annual bonus. This was more than enough to end her position. It might even open her up to legal consequences. But again, I knew timing was everything. The next HOA meeting was only a week away, and she was undoubtedly going to use it as her stage for a comeback attempt. If I revealed the emails at the right moment, in front of the same packed room as before, it would be the end of her. I spent that week preparing. I organized the emails into a printed packet, highlighting the worst statements. I cross-referenced them with the financial data and the meeting minutes, creating an airtight chain of evidence. And this time, I had more than just documents. I had allies. The residents who had been targeted after the last meeting agreed to speak up, each with their own proof of sudden, baseless violations. We didn't just want her gone. We wanted a complete board restructuring, with term limits and independent audits to prevent this from happening again. By the night of the meeting, the room was even fuller than last time. People who hadn't attended in years were standing along the walls. And when Linda walked in, she smiled like nothing had changed, as if the previous meeting had been a minor inconvenience she had already brushed off. She had no idea that before the night was over, she'd be walking out without the title she had clung to for years. The meeting room felt different this time, not just crowded, but charged. You could sense it in the way people shifted in their seats, in the murmurs that rippled through the rows whenever a board member glanced up from their notes. This wasn't going to be another polite community discussion. This was going to be a reckoning. The meeting began as usual with routine agenda items. Linda, still sitting in the president's seat, wore a confident smile, speaking as if the last 2 sessions hadn't completely unraveled her authority. She breezed through the first half of the agenda, likely thinking she could control the narrative by staying ahead of any challenges. Then we reached the resident concerns section. I stood up, packet in hand, and announced that I had additional evidence regarding board conduct, specifically correspondence and financial records that directly contradicted the president's prior statements. The room went quiet. I didn't waste time. I walked to the front table, set the packets down in front of each board member, and handed the rest to the residents. The first few pages were the internal emails, Linda's own words, discussing ways to target residents who challenged her, including me by name. There were lines about building a paper trail for removal and stacking violations to wear people down. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then came the financial documents, budget summaries tied directly to invoices for her personal property upgrades, and the casual annual bonus joke she'd made in one of the emails. By the time the last page was read, the room wasn't quiet anymore. It was a controlled storm. Neighbors speaking over each other, demanding accountability, calling for an immediate vote to remove her from the board entirely. Linda tried to fight back. She claimed the emails were taken out of context, and the financial records were misinterpreted, but it didn't matter. The evidence was too clear, the paper trail too direct. Every time she tried to justify herself, someone read her own words back to her. And then the final blow came not from me, but from the board member who had given me the emails in the first place. He confirmed on record that the correspondence was authentic and that multiple board members had raised concerns about her conduct over the years, but had been ignored or intimidated into silence. That was the moment it was over. A motion to remove her was made, seconded, and passed by a show of hands. The vote wasn't even close. Within minutes, Linda was no longer HOA president. She left the room with her head high, but her hands shaking, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The fallout didn't stop there. The board agreed to nullify my $5,000 fine entirely and review every other fine issued during Linda's presidency for possible reimbursement. They also passed a motion to have an independent auditor review the HOA finances for the past 5 years, something that made more than a few faces at the table pale. When the meeting finally adjourned, I stepped outside into the cool night air and felt something I hadn't in months: relief. Not just for myself, but for the entire neighborhood. In the weeks that followed, changes happened fast. The HOA introduced term limits, stricter transparency requirements, and a clause preventing any board member from voting on matters directly benefiting their own property. They even sent out a letter acknowledging past mismanagement and committing to rebuilding trust with residents. But the part that still makes me smile: a month later, after the audit began, the HOA was forced to issue refunds for improperly collected fines, including mine. The check arrived in a plain envelope made out to me for $5,000. I cashed it the same day. And with that money, I bought more flowers, brighter, bolder, and more colorful than before, planted right in the front yard for everyone to see. The HOA didn't say a word, because now they knew better.